Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. My name is Jackie Fatka. As many of you have heard, the Biden administration has has called for a fuel tax, 3-month suspension on the federal fuel tax, and encouraging states to follow suit. Joining us today to talk about the impact of this proposal at the federal and state levels is Mike Steenhoek, the executive director of the Soy Transportation Coalition. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with an update on the federal fuel tax suspension. There was a lot of talk about a week ago on this. So update us on where things currently at and how likely is it that we could actually see this put into effect?
Well, the president proposed this last week, and subsequent to that, I would say the response from both Republicans and Democrats has been quite tepid. There's a kind of a recognition of a need to do something related to our escalating costs of fuel, but there is a degree of a hesitancy to actually suspend the fuel tax, and for obviously a variety of reasons. So it's something that's still being considered, but there clearly isn't a resounding kind of surge of support for it. We will continue to see political pressure to do something related to fuel costs, and when you look at the arrows in the quiver of the government, particularly the federal government, to do something about it, there's a limited number of arrows that they can do, and so the fuel tax certainly is one, and I understand why there is a consideration of that. So it's something that's going to continue to be discussed and debated, but at least up to this point, I'm not really seeing this bipartisan federal and state groundswell of support for it.
So you mentioned the federal challenges. Some states are coming forward and taking some action. Do you anticipate other states coming forward? Can you give us an update on which states have taken some action when it comes to their fuel taxes?
Yeah, there's been a handful of states that have done that, but I think it's going to be quite limited. Even though, again, there's public pressure to do something related to fuel costs. When you just think about it procedurally, most states have legislatures that only meet a part of the year, and it's usually in the early few months of a year. And so these fuel taxes are codified into law, passed by the legislature and signed into law by the governor. So unless there is some kind of arcane provision at an individual state level, and I'm not aware of any, that would allow the governor to temporarily suspend that, most of this is going to have to be an act of the legislature if they want to temporarily suspend it. And I don't see a lot of states electing to call their legislatures back into special session to entertain something like that. Now, there are a number of states that have year-long legislatures, and they're in a position to do something like that. But for most of the states, I wouldn't anticipate seeing a lot of suspensions of the fuel tax.
So, Mike, one of the reasons why I love talking with you is because you put the numbers behind a lot of these policy proposals that we hear. And I know you've done a little calculations on what this actually means if we do see the federal tax suspended or federal and state tax suspended. What does that mean for a farmer per day as it relates to the total fuel cost here?
Yeah, I mean, the dilemma in running those kind of calculations, and you can get into danger because you have to first define what is a typical farmer. That's really a challenge. But what I wanted to do is profile a farmer that a lot of other farmers will relate to. So, taking someone who has 1,100 acres, corn and soybeans, but a lot of states, they might have higher weight limits for semis. Others are more restricted to an 80,000 pound configuration. Clearly, some farmers deliver further than others. But taking a farmer that has that kind of operation, and if you have a 25-mile journey to your delivery location, so that's a 50-mile round trip, what does that mean for that typical farmer? And if you're looking at a suspension of the federal and the average state diesel tax, and the average state diesel tax is 40.24 cents per gallon. The federal fuel tax on diesel is 24.4 cents. So you add those together and you would suspend that. That would amount to a $2.51 a day that farmer pays, clearly not in fuel, but in the fuel tax, federal plus state. If just the federal diesel tax were suspended, and again, that's at 24.4 cents per gallon, that would amount to 95 cents a day that farmer pays in the form of that federal fuel tax. Now, clearly there are a number of farmers that drive further distances to get to the delivery location. Those farmers will be impacted more severely by the cost of fuel, including the fuel tax. If you're a farmer that has a side trucking business, and quite a substantial number of farmers do, obviously fuel taxes will be more consequential to them as well. So clearly there's some real pain at the pump. But I do think it's important to put this into context about not what you pay in fuel, but what you pay in the fuel tax, because that's what the debate is about. And to have a proper, reasonable discussion about something like suspending the fuel tax, I do think it's important to understand more thoroughly what the benefit would be, but then also making sure that you're addressing what the costs of that would be. And then once you have a better understanding of that, I think you can make a better decision.
So you mentioned the cost, and from the federal standpoint, I believe it's about $6 billion that would not be part of the federal treasury if you were to suspend that. Where could we not see that? What kind of impact does that have if we don't have that $6 billion coming in? And are we even guaranteed to have lower fuel prices if we actually do suspend the fuel tax?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of questions that relate to it. So, number one, the question is, would a farmer or would your average motorist realize that savings? The way the fuel tax is administered in this country is that it's imposed on the actual wholesalers of the fuel. So that's a relatively small group of people who are actually writing the check to the federal government. And then those wholesalers pass that cost on to eventually the motorists as we're all filling up our cars or our trucks. So the question is, and a lot of people wonder whether the savings would completely get passed on to the motorist or the farmer or whoever, or would it be largely enjoyed by the wholesalers? Because there's a lot of white noise that really asserts itself on the cost of fuel that we eventually pay for. So I wouldn't expect that if a fuel tax were to be suspended, that on day one, you would have your regular cost that you pay. And then on day two, after it gets enacted, you would see a very distinct 18.4 cent per gallon reduction in your gasoline tax, which is what the federal gas tax is, or a 24.4 cent per gallon on diesel fuel. I wouldn't expect to see that very obvious kind of benefit that we would receive. So that's one of the real questions is, to what extent will we even enjoy the benefits of that? Will it be received by us, or will it be largely enjoyed by the wholesalers? And I think that's a very valid question.
So switching gears a little bit, obviously you and I are filling up our gas tanks and feeling the hurt, but when you fill up a tractor tank full of gas, or even a combine, there's some wheat areas that are going hardcore with their combines here in Ohio, where I'm located. There's some combines starting to roll. What are farmers doing to manage some of these higher fuel costs? And is there things that they should be doing now to prepare for this fall when it comes to that input cost of diesel cost?
Yeah, I mean, there's some ways to manage it. What's the unfortunate reality about fuel is that there are fewer opportunities to really manage your risk like you can with when you're marketing your crop, or you're securing your inputs like fertilizer or seed or those kind of things. You have more things at your disposal when you're really trying to manage any kind of cost escalation. Fuel, there's less ability to do that. So it really is having a real impact on farmers. You can't have an increase in diesel fuel, which it's grown 74% over the last year from $3.28 to $5.71 average nationwide. You can't have that kind of cost escalation without having some significant impact. So clearly there needs to be some real energy of thought and creativity in how we can provide relief for these farmers, for these motorists. But I do think it's reasonable to question whether the fuel tax is the appropriate way of doing that.
So you mentioned early on those different arrows, those opportunities to try to shoot at this issue. What are some other things that are on the table that are being discussed that could have an impact?
Yeah, some states have decided to be more broad in providing a degree of tax relief to their constituents. I think there's a wide array of things that you can look at as far as, well, what's the bottom line? Well, we need to provide some kind of monetary relief for our constituents. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for that, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. Just that's more broad than just focusing on fuel itself, because inflation is really raising its ugly head, not just on fuel, but in a variety of areas. But a real concern that I think that I have related to suspending the fuel tax is we run the risk of making it a political football. And as inadequate and as the fuel tax can be, it has proven to be throughout its history a pretty reliable source of funding for our federal government and for state governments in being able to maintain and improve our infrastructure. And if you talk to any state Department of Transportation, they'll say a couple things. Number one, it's critical to have a sufficient volume of funding, but it's also just as critical to have predictability of that funding. And the fuel tax has been a pretty predictable, reliable source of funding that state departments of transportation can rely on as they aspire to maintain and improve that infrastructure, which does require a lot of planning. So if we start taking ourselves down the road of doing a temporary suspension of the fuel tax, you run the risk of it becoming a political football. And if you all of a sudden suspend the fuel tax at one moment and then allow it to rebound, then anytime fuel costs go up, or actually anytime there's an election impending, that will result in it becoming a less reliable, less predictable short source of funding. And if we care about having infrastructure projects built on time and within budget, having our funding mechanism all of a sudden become less reliable, less predictable, will be an excellent way of increasing the costs of our roads and bridges and delaying their completion. So you really want to make sure that you maintain that predictability and that reliability of that funding source. And that's what really concerns me as we have this discussion, is making a funding mechanism for our roads and bridges, making it into a political football. That would be unfortunate.
You segued perfectly into my next question, and you mentioned inflation and the impact on infrastructure cost. Obviously, in the last year, we did get across the finish line a really big win by the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law that took many, many months. But for infrastructure, we finally have a huge infusion of money coming in. But now all of a sudden that money might not go as far. Talk to me about some of the research and insight that you've gained on what the impact of inflation is on infrastructure cost.
Yeah, I was corresponding with a county engineer recently, and he mentioned that his expected increase in funding that he will have available to him to maintain their county infrastructure system, a rural county, was about 18%. So an 18% increase in funding, largely coming from the federal government, which is, again, that's good news. We supported the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that the president signed last year. We're glad that became law. But this county engineer mentioned that with that 18% increase in funding that he anticipates, on top of that, there is a 21% increase in the cost of actually improving and maintaining our roads and bridges. So that's a real concern, is that the purchasing power of our taxpayer dollars is not extending as far as it should. And so when you look at that overall 20 to 21% increase in the cost of infrastructure of building and maintaining roads and bridges, you see asphalt growing by 80%. You see concrete increasing, labor, of course, machinery, all of those things coming together. It's really going to ensure that we don't have as much bang for our buck with this increased infrastructure spending.
Where do we solve that? Is that push it out sooner, or how do we address those inflation costs as they impact this increase in cost for infrastructure?
Well, one of the things that does concern me is that the overwhelming majority of that infrastructure spending come from the federal government has yet to be deployed. So in the near future, we're going to see more of that funding come online, and it's going to result in infrastructure projects moving forward. Well, when we live in this era of this infrastructure inflation, and you've got limited labor, you've got limited number of contractors, you've got limited supply in all of these inputs, things like asphalt and concrete and machinery. And then all of a sudden you've got this significant amount of money all of a sudden being deployed. It's going to all the more provide pressure on all of these components. And this infrastructure inflation is expected to grow. So one of the questions that I've asked, and I continue to ask, is, are we, the federal government, providing flexibility for states to utilize this funding? There naturally is a desire, and rightfully so, to invest that money quickly. That's usually a more efficient way of getting things done, a more cost-effective ways of getting things done. But if you all of a sudden are providing incentives to get that money spent sooner rather than later, all of these states are going to be doing the same thing, and that's going to further put upward pressure on the cost of these construction projects, further eroding the value of the taxpayer dollar. So I think we really need to make sure that we're providing some degree of flexibility, so that states can prioritize the things that need to get done now, but then defer it for later, so that you're actually making the cost of these projects more manageable.
Is that something that has to be done at the state level, or is that something that just the federal execution of getting all these dollars out, that they're able to offer that flexibility? Where does that authority rest?
Yeah, that resides with the Federal Highway Administration, which is the main entity administering the funding for, at least for surface transportation like roads and bridges. So it clearly, it's a conversation that needs to occur between the states and the federal government, but it's the Federal Highway Administration. It's usually in the form of providing incentives for getting the money spent sooner rather than later. There's not anything punitive if they don't get the money spent, but there is an incentive. And so, but the net effect is kind of the same, where you're really encouraging all of the spending in a constricted period of time, which again, that's going to drive up the costs of these projects. And that would be really unfortunate. So I think there's a balance to have with this. And so I think this is a discussion that we clearly need to continue to have as we move forward.
Kind of switching back to the fuel cost and agribusinesses and trucks, we have a lot of issues of being able to get things, but truckers are having to they're dealt with these higher fuel costs. Are they making any changes? Are we seeing changes in how farmers are getting their products to and from the elevators, or other agribusinesses? Are we seeing some states take actions on axle loads? What are some things that are being done to help manage those costs, whether that's from a policy level or from actions taken by those who are trucking themselves?
Well, a discussion that we're encouraging that needs to happen with greater vigor is the whole issue of efficiency of trucking. There's been a number of states that have instituted either temporary or long-lasting weight limit increases for agriculture and other industries. We've long advocated for increased weight limits with additional axle configurations, because then with that additional axle, it provides additional braking friction so that stopping distances are actually less than a traditional 5-axle 80,000-pound semi. You're displacing the weight so that the imprint on the road is actually less than that traditional configuration. It has a favorable story to tell on motorist safety, because one of the things that the data clearly express is that motor safety is more of a function of the number of semis in a given stretch of road rather than the weight of those individual semis. So if you're a grain elevator transporting X many bushels of soybeans and corn, you can either do that with a lot of semis or fewer semis. Well, the fewer semi scenario will be a more safe scenario. So we think that is something that the government, whether it's the federal government or the state government, they can lean into this and provide significant relief, quite quickly, if they are able to provide that kind of regulatory arrangement. So we think that makes a lot of sense. You've got fuel costs going up. You've got concerns with the rail industry. You've got a desire to transport more because farmers are growing more, which is a good thing. So when you put all these things together, labor shortages, we think it makes a lot of sense to increase the efficiency of our trucks, and having that additional axle with additional weight, we think that makes a tremendous amount of sense.
I know another big win in the bipartisan infrastructure bill was some of the funding for ports and waterways. And I know something that obviously soybean producers very interested in how that money is allocated and put to use. Provide an update on where the money from the infrastructure bill is on the ports and waterways.
Yeah, we were very happy with some increased investment in ports, and again, a lot of that is going to be forthcoming. The U.S. Maritime Administration has a grant program called the Port Infrastructure Development Program, and so a significant amount of funding is going to be deployed to ports, which is very important. For an industry like soybeans, that over half of what is produced is ultimately exported. You got to have a quality inventory of ports. A big win that we were very supportive of, and working with the barge and towing industry and others in agriculture, is the green light for new construction at Lock and Dam 25 on the Mississippi River, which is about 45 miles north of St. Louis. That's a project that we in agriculture and beyond have long advocated for, and we were really pleased to see it receive the green light. A collection of agricultural organizations, particularly soybean organizations, have offered the Army Corps of Engineers $1 million to help underwrite some of the costs of that project. I think this funding offer is even more timely given the infrastructure inflation that we're witnessing. One of the things that I think we're going to see a lot of announcements we're going to see in the weeks and months to come from federal, state, and local government will be, we originally anticipated this project to cost this, and now we have to revise it up to this. Or we were originally planning to have this project completed on this day, and now we're going to have to move it to this day. Expect a lot of cost increases and project delays when it comes to these significant or even local infrastructure projects. So things like working with the private sector, with this Lock and M25 is a good example of it. With that funding offer from farmers, I think that's it makes those kind of arrangements all the more timely.
I know soybean producers haven't been impacted, but a lot of ag sectors have been impacted by some of the shipping container issues. And we did just get across the finish line and to the president's desk, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and being able to give the Federal Maritime Commission kind of more teeth and being able to make sure that there's not empty containers going back to China, and being able to make sure that the folks aren't hit with demurrage and detention fees. And I know those are a lot of big words, but when it comes to the ag sector and being able to have the ocean shipping reform now in law, detail what you see as some of those positives that came out from that passage.
Yeah, and we were supportive of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Those who export agricultural products via containers, whether these 20-foot long steel boxes or 40-foot long steel boxes, have clearly been adversely affected by some of these supply chain challenges. About 5 to 7% of soybeans get exported via containers on a given year. So most of our exports do occur via bulk, but the container market is a very important one, and it's a growing one, and we really want to be supportive of it. The challenge when you try to address these kind of problems within our supply chain is you want to make sure you don't you're not like the proverbial squeezing the balloon, where you might mitigate pressure in one area, but then you see you've augmented pressure in another area, and you'll conclude that, wait a second, I thought I was solving a problem over here, but then we see that we've created another problem over there. And a lot of times when you try to have a regulatory solution to a problem, it's kind of like squeezing that balloon. So we didn't want to do that. So we didn't want to create any harm long-term on this industry in their ability to transport and accommodate agricultural exports. But we do think that the value of this piece of legislation is that it does provide some greater authority to the Federal Maritime Commission to mediate between the interests of those exporters, particularly agricultural exporters, and the owners of the containers, the steamship lines, the ocean vessel companies. And if you ever have two particular interest groups, and in this case, the ocean carriers, and then the customers, and if you have a federal agency, the Federal Maritime Commission, that has established itself as a mediator between those two camps, good government would just suggest to me that process needs to be accessible. And if there is wrongdoing that is occurring, the mediator, the government, needs to be able to take corrective action. So we're overall happy that the legislation passed. The problem is obviously much more diverse than one particular piece of legislation can address. But we do think that it was a good piece of legislation. We're glad that we saw that it was passed into law.
Good government. That's what we can always hope for, right? That proper balance between regulatory and business and being able to function properly. Well, so it's always a pleasure to speak with you, Mike. Mike Steenhoek, Executive Director of the Soybean Transportation Coalition. Thank you so much for enlightening us today on some of those tough topics when it comes to fuel and transportation. And it's always so great to get your insight. We thank you for your time today. Until next time, with Feedstuffs 365, this is Jackie Fatka.